okay, so we're here for part two. It's like a part two segment of a great interview that we did last Thursday with Pete B. It's an absolute privilege, and thanks again, Pete, for giving us your time like this, you know, to delve into the history of Narcotics Anonymous.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure.
It's truly valuable, and we're learning so much. Maybe we could start after we finished last week's interview. You sent me a very I don't know what to call it, amusing anecdote about, because we were talking about chapters 8 and 10 and how it was the greater Philadelphia area that was involved in We Do Recover and More Will Be Revealed, and that was great. But then you remembered something, didn't you?
Yeah. I remember, well, you know, I'd forgotten about this for many years, and my friend George had reminded me about it a few years ago. And, you know, and as soon as he mentioned it, it all came back to me. I was like, wow, I forgot all about that. When, you know, that summer, this is the summer of 1980. So it would have been like late August, early September, I think it was, that, you know, I had, both George and I had, you know, we couldn't afford our individual apartments anymore. So we decided we'd move in together, you know, to, you know, kind of get economy of cost. And I went, look, I found this little farmhouse out in the country in Ivyland, Pennsylvania, that, you know, that we could afford. So we moved into that. And, you know, shortly after we moved in, George went off to the Third World Literature Conference. And he went off to Lincoln shortly after we moved in together. That was the Second World Literature Conference. Then later in that late fall, I think it was in November, that he went out to Memphis. And in between those two conferences in those couple of months, we had the Bristol Literature Committee that I talked about last time had been working. George had come back from the Second World Literature Conference in Lincoln, Nebraska, with a lot of material for chapter 8, We Do Recover. And so the Bristol Literature Committee started working on that. And we were doing the cut and paste that we talked about before. And we had I'd say we had about a dozen addicts that were very involved with that effort. And we'd go through everything. We'd, you know, we had that we already had an outline. They had kind of come up with an outline for the chapters in Lincoln. So we're working from that outline, and we're just trying to find appropriate material that would fit into the outline. And then we would create kind of connecting, you know, sentences and whatnot. And I had some editing skills, so I was trying to edit it into a readable format. And then, you know, we, in the meantime, some addicts from Northeast Philadelphia, which they were about 20 miles below us, but it was like a world apart, you know, because it's a whole different world. We used to go to a meeting down in Oxford Circle on Friday nights in Northeast Philly. And at that, we went down there, and George announced what, you know, what the literature committee that we had formed, and invited people to come up and work with us. And he got approached by a number of addicts after the meeting and said, hey, could you start one down here? And he was like, well, you know, why can't you guys just come up to Bucks County? You know, and they said, well, you know, most of them didn't have cars, because in the city, you don't really need a car to get around. You have public transportation, but in Bucks County, you definitely need, especially out in the country where we were, you needed a car. So, you know, they said, we'd like to, you know, start our own committee down here. He said, oh yeah, you could do that. And he gave them the guide to a literature committee and everything. And they said, well, we'd like you to chair it. And George was like, well, you know, and they said, because you got experience, we don't. You know, you've been to a World Literature Conference, so you know what to do. So he kind of agreed, and you know, wherever George went, I pretty much went with him. You know, because you know, he was that guy that had the 3 years, you know, clean, and I was doing whatever George, you know, did. So plus I had the typewriter, so we went down. Well, first off, George, you know, let Bo know, because Bo was the chair of World Lit at the time. He let Bo know that they were starting this committee in Northeast Philadelphia, and you know, we explained to him why they, you know, they, even though we were all in the same area at the same time at that time, we, you know, it was just logistically, it was hard, and they really wanted to be involved. So the first meeting down there in Northeast Philly, there was like, it was in this girl Debbie's kind of like her townhouse. It was like a row house. They had row houses down there, and there was so many addicts crammed into that place that me and George are out in the hallway, like talking to everyone from the doorway, kind of thing. There wasn't even room to get in there. There's just addicts all on top of each other. There had to be at least 30 of them. It was overwhelming, and they all wanted to contribute. So George pulled out, some of the work that we've been doing on chapter 8 and said, well, here's what we got done so far. And they all kind of looked like they were like a little disappointed. And he goes, is there something wrong? Did I miss something? And they said, well, we thought we could do our own chapter. And George was like, oh, well, okay. So he calls Bo up, and Bo's still trying to get his head around, why don't, and when, George explained it to him. So Bo said, yeah, go, we don't have anybody working on more will be revealed yet. Why don't you have them work on that? So they sent us all the material. I typed everything up because I would type all the incoming material, because it would be coming in all different forms and fashions. So we type it up and then make a lot of copies so people could have it, could cut it up and paste it as appropriate. So we, and I liked it because as long as I had something to type, I was all right, and, give me something to type, I'm good. So anyway, so that's the process. So we had Bucks County, we were, one night a week we were meeting, with the Bristol Literature Committee, and then another night of the week we were meeting with the Philadelphia Literature Committee, and we're doing this work.
So you're actually overseeing the two chapters and pulling them together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. George was chairing both of them, and I was just helping to edit and type and edit and everything. So finally, we got all the work done. We really wanted to have it done before the Third World Literature Conference, because we knew they wanted to try and pull a draft of the book together from there. Originally, we were trying to have the book ready to go from there. But when we were communicating with all the regions and around the country and the areas, and the feedback we got was everybody would like to see a draft copy first and do a review and provide input, which we said that's great, because this was getting more people involved. Yeah. So that was the plan in Memphis, was to have that draft ready to go, to give everybody time to review and edit it. So I couldn't make it to Memphis. I had a new job that I was trying to hang on to. I was going through jobs like water, and I just really needed to, I was trying to be responsible in my life. So, but I knew I was doing my part. I was doing a lot of work on it, from home. So you could say I was teleworking in 1980, on this work, because I did a ton of work before I ever got to my first World Literature Conference. But at any rate, I think the most valuable thing I did is going to be this story, and I still get tickled when we read chapter 10, when George reminded me of this. So George drove down to Memphis, and that was almost a 20-hour drive from Philadelphia, and he gets down there when suddenly he realizes he packed chapter 8, but he had chapter 10. He had that, he was reading that the night before, and he had it on his bedside table. He left it there. He forgot to, he was just kind of reading through just to see, you kind of doing that final read through. So George calls me up at home, and he goes, hey, Pete, I need you to come down here. And I'm like, George, I can't come down there. I can't do it. And I really was trying to, hang on to this job, and I had bills I had to pay and everything else. And I was like, I'm not going, And he said, I left chapter 10 on my bedside table. I need you to get it here somehow. And I was like, okay. So I tried like FedEx, and it was like in the evening now. I tried FedEx and UPS, and none of them can get it there the next day. So I honestly don't remember whether I thought of this or if somebody else gave me the idea, but the next thing I know, I am driving out to Philadelphia airport, and I'm looking for any flights to Memphis. And I found one. There was the last flight going to Memphis was leaving. And back then, this was before 9/11, so you could do this kind of thing. I went up to the gate, and where there was a line of people, and I checked kind of checked everybody out, and there's this one lady who looked very, very trustworthy, and I kind of like that. So I just kind of started chatting with her. I said, hey, I know this sounds strange, but I have this package that I really need to get to my friend George in Memphis, and I said, this is really important. This, like, lives depend on this. And she took it. She was like, yeah, what, so I handed her this package, and, and George met her at the airport later that night. And so they, chapters 8 and 10 arrived in Memphis. They were ready to go. So they were able to work on all the other stuff, at Memphis. They didn't have to worry about chapters 8 and 10. So I thought about that, because I thought, now, if I hadn't been able to do that, they would have had to start working from scratch in chapter 10 down in Memphis, and it might have come out totally different. Who knows? But when I read chapter 10 in the Gray Book today, it's like, I was like, yeah, that's I get tickled at that, and those kind of things happened all the time. I mean, we were forced to be resourceful because we did not have any money. We didn't have any money to do any of this. We had to come up with. George sold his washer and dryer to get to the Second World Literature Conference because he had a washer and dryer. We had a washer and dryer in Ivyland, so he didn't need the ones he had in his apartment. So he sold them to get a train ticket to go to, Lincoln for the Second World Literature Conference.
This stuff's really important because it's what people don't see. It's what we don't quite appreciate, because we see this amazing book that we use every day. And we know that there were committees, and we've heard the stories about the blood, which we now know was for the flyer to go out and not for typewriter ribbon. But it's all these other things. It's all the other mechanics, and the sacrifices that were made. That was the beautiful thing that I took away as well from the interview last week when I said, what was the spiritual awakening? And I was thinking someone coming up to you and saying, thank you for. And you said, no, the spiritual awakening was being able to now work a set of NA steps that we'd forgone so we could do the book. And that to me just blew my mind.
Yeah, it really definitely felt like there is a power much greater than us. And whether it was the collective power of the desire to carry this message. I know I personally had a powerful desire because it took me 2.5 years to find NA when it was right in my backyard. So I got involved with public information. George had been the chair for the Philadelphia area. When he stepped down, I became the chair. And it just so happened that the Philadelphia Phillies made it into the World Series that fall. And that's baseball. So that's kind of like the World Series in baseball is kind of like the World Cup, like you guys just went through with the football. Well, I just saying to you guys, we were there too, but it's a big deal. And back then it was even more of a big deal. And, we got a spot on Game 6, the final game in which the Phillies won their first ever World Series. In the middle of the game, we got a spot where it just came on and it said, if you want to use drugs, that's your business. If you want to stop using drugs, that's ours. And it had the hotline number.
Oh, and that's a good one. I like that message. That's really
simple. It was just public information. It was not, we didn't promise anything. We didn't promise that you'd have a nice new car and a new job and everything. We just said, if you want to stop, that's it.
And you got this in the was it the final game of the World Series?
It was in the broadcast, in the televised broadcast of the World Series, which went out to millions of people. But we knew there was a lot of people in Philadelphia watching that because the Phillies had never gotten that far, in a World Series, and that was we were dogged. We were dogged and persistent. We got an interview for the Philadelphia Bulletin. They ran an article, and we had an interview on a local television channel where we had a couple of addicts were on there with their faces blacked out and their voices, kind of garbled, but just talking about NA. So we wanted to any way possible to let addicts know that we're here.
I think there's always the debate. I told you I think last week that I was having a conversation with another addict who was saying, look, to even think that we could put a book together in the way that the guys did back then now with you know, the group conscience process, the reviewing, it would be impossible to do. So it was almost like, look, get over it. You know, we've got.
That's what they said. That's what they said in the 70s. That
Did they say that too? Okay.
They started talking about a book in early 70s, and they kept saying it'll never happen. It'll never happen. Addicts can't write. You know, addicts can't write. It'll never happen. Addicts never follow through. You know, there's a lot of negative aspects to that people associated with being addicts, and you know, it was born out of necessity. It's like I was saying last week, and this I've kind of, you know, in some of my research when I was working on history, I realized that like we you know, this book came along right at the time when addiction was just taking off.
Yeah.
Worldwide, but you know, we know, I know in America it was just taking off. Crack was about to happen. You know, there's just a lot of things were happening that was going to be sending a lot more people were going to be getting you know, afflicted by the condition of addiction. And you know, I feel like that's another thing where I do feel like there was a higher power guiding, you know, events, because you know, this book just showed up just in time for the plague of addiction. And I think some of the resurgence that we're seeing right now because of you know, the connections that we've made because of the pandemic. I mean, we have this really bad, I'm not sure if it's happening worldwide, but we have this really bad problem in this country with the
fentanyl.
With fentanyl, and it, you know, it's really bad. And the margin for error for an addict today is much smaller than it was back, you know. Back then, you could tell someone, if you didn't think somebody was ready, you could say, hey, go out and use and come back when you're ready. We don't do that today. Yeah. Because they might go out and they might die when they go back out there, you know. So
with that said, Pete, then, I'm really maybe we'll try and sort of drill down on this point. The person who was saying, look, there's you know, there's groups in Iran with thousands of people. You would never be able to put a book out and get true group conscience. It has to be done the way it's done now, which you could argue is maybe a bit corporatized. But then there's a whole section of people or addicts in NA who feel that, you know, literature is something we could still be producing. And then the second part to that maybe is what you've just described. You know, maybe the basic text at the beginning of the 80s with the crack epidemic was the right kind of literature to carry the message at the right time. You know, when I used to pick up, like when I used to look at the big book, for instance, and it would feel like it was like so decades removed. You know, I couldn't even connect with like whatever it was. It seems so old fashioned. You know, and I just wonder if there's if the Renaissance and a new literature movement in NA could be guided by the new set of conditions that we find ourselves in.
Well, there's always a way. You know, the reason that it was important to write a book, to put together a book of the experience, was addicts had a hard time identifying with the older literature.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, most of us didn't have much clean time. Most of us didn't have a whole lot of experience in recovery. And yet we just wanted people to know that we were able to stay clean and that we did find recovery here, right? Well, let's fast forward 40 years down the road. How many addicts do we have that have a lifetime of recovery? I spent 10 years in addiction and 42 and a half years in recovery, okay? And I'm not alone. There's a lot of people like me. Every day I see on Facebook somebody else is celebrating 40 years, you know? And all that experience, and somehow, you know, somebody thinks it's a better idea to have a professional guy, you know, drafted up and then circulated to selected people, you know, to edit and everything. So they do kind of say that we are, you know, it is written by addicts for addicts, but not really, because for us it was just, you know, there wasn't, we weren't controlling the outcome.
Yes.
We were trusting a higher power to let the voice of the addict come through. And the important thing is that voice of the addict is so important. So I don't want to dog the literature that's come
No.
out. I think a lot of it is actually really well done.
Oh, it was great. Yeah.
Well done. It reads really well. But the question is, how does it resonate with that newcomer?
Yeah. That's a
Do
really
they
good
read
question.
it? Does it go over their head? Is it speaking their language?
And remember, that was the starting point for what you guys were doing. Remember when it was like kind of newcomer contribute? Well, you had 5 months when you were typing this stuff up. And, and maybe this is another issue which we maybe don't want to get bogged down in, but it's the hierarchy, you know, which we say the newcomer is the most important person, but there's a hierarchy which
when we talk about a hierarchy, we've completely forgotten about the inverted pyramid.
Exactly.
This is supposed to be. Yeah. The member in the group are supposed to be at the top of that,
and that's what's lost.
That pyramid, and everything else is supposed to be there to serve them, not to tell them how we're going to do this.
So maybe the question,
God speaks himself through our group conscience, as it talks about a tradition, and group autonomy. These are the important things, and you know what, and I don't fight that, because that's been here for a long time, and you know it's been working to some degree. You can't argue with success. It's been working to some degree, but the question is, how do we make the true group conscience, group autonomy, method of recovery available, and we do it in the each one teach one. I do it in my world. I do it. I practice it. I practice. I don't pay attention to concepts because they were built for something else.
Yeah.
They don't really. I don't have an opinion about concepts because they're as far as I'm concerned, they're an outside issue.
Yes.
But the 12 steps and the 12 traditions, I practice every single day. I work with other addicts. You know, I go to groups that are about group conscience and group autonomy, and I don't care what literature they're using.
Yeah.
You know, my home group here in town. You know, I mean, we use a lot of the literature that's come out more recently. I'm good with it, you know. I mean, because there's something in there for everybody. But you know, what I use when I'm working with somebody is I pretty much use Back to the Gray Book as a step guide. Yeah. You know, and because I've just seen that work. I'm watching addicts' lives be transformed with that.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's to me, it's like I use what works. You know, the bottom line is we want something that's going to work in our lives, right?
So maybe rather when it's like it will be impossible to get full group conscience across the world on new literature, maybe the idea then is a kind of grassroots movement, a true grassroots movement where groups are who are interested in this kind of thing, because you know, it can't just be a one-off event that happened, right, you know, where it was true group conscience text and that's it. Addicts have got nothing else to contribute. You were in the meetings taking notes and that stuff was going into the book. That was another revelation, like an oral history revelation that you would never read anywhere, that had to come from you. And maybe that's the way the new literature has to come, from the individual groups.
Sure, why not? Why not? Yeah. You know, if it's group, and you know, like people say, but you know, we talk about group autonomy, but that tradition also talks about accepting matters that affect other groups or NA as a whole. Mm-hmm. Well, what we did in Bucks County, PA, affected other groups in NA as a whole in a very positive fashion. Okay, we were the first group that actually started writing on steps and traditions to pass on to others. And you know, we made a decision in group conscience, and then later we found that this other groups were interested, so we shared what we were doing with them. And then later on, we found out there was this movement to write an NA basic text, and our material was helpful with that because it gave them a starting point for the steps and the traditions, and you know, gave some material to start, you know, bouncing off people and you know, and all that. So because you need to start somewhere, right? And you know, and if you're starting with the voice of the addict, you're starting in the right place. Not the voice of the professional addicts. I know most of the professionals are addicts too. You know, a lot of them are members, but that's not the point. You know, the point is, you know, having that, you know, reading it to newcomers and seeing if it makes sense to them. You know, because we did that in the literature conferences. You know.
So for anyone, just to speak more directly then to anyone that's watching this that is really interested, what would your message be to groups or members or addicts who were, listen, I've got something to contribute here. I feel, we've been workshopping step 10 questions, for instance, and there's a whole new ones that are more pointed and actually, help us evolve,
Form a local literature committee and just start doing it. Another fabulous product that can come out of that kind of effort is a newsletter.
Yes, you were involved, of course, weren't you yourself?
Your group could have a newsletter. Why not? That was one of the things that really fired us up in Bucks County at the Bristol Lit Committee was that Rainbow Connection newsletter. And they encouraged us to start our own newsletter, and we did. We started the Clean Sheet, which was the Philadelphia newsletter. That Clean Sheet was still being produced 10 years ago. so that thing was around for over 35 years.
You know what I love about that as well is that I take it submissions were coming in from members and groups, and it
sure.
was
we circulated it to all the groups in the area, in the Philadelphia area, and in it we told people how they could contribute. We encouraged people to subscribe, to help offset the cost, but basically we provided it freely to all groups. Then I think the next year, it's in late 1982. A couple of us started up a regional newsletter for the Mid-Atlantic region. That was called the Freedom Connection, and that I had a very, very humbling experience with that one. Somehow, a copy of the Freedom Connection newsletter got into the infamous Attica prison, got behind the walls, and an addict in there picked that up and got inspired to try to get clean. He wrote and requested some literature. We sent him literature. We gave him we gave him a subscription, so we would send him a copy every month because we were coming out monthly with it. And I went to the World Convention in New York City in 1983, and I was not expecting this, but somebody came up from behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around and I said, "How you doing?" He says, "Hi, I'm Tony C." I said, "How you doing, Tony? Nice to meet you." He goes, No, I'm Tony C. You've been writing to me." And I'm like, "You're Tony C from Attica?" And he says, "Well, I'm not from there anymore. I'm out." And he was clean, and he was at a World Convention, and in the smile on his face, there were times it was a royal pain in the neck getting an issue out, just the logistics of it all and getting the input. But when I looked at that man's face and he was smiling and he was clean, and when he got his first issue of the Freedom Connection, he was an addict in Attica, and facing long time, but somehow he got things turned around and he got released, and that made it all worthwhile. I was like, oh my God, I was looking in the eyes of a miracle, and to me that was just brilliant, and so this is something that anybody can, if you got something to say, write it down and put it out there. We have so many tools available to us now. You don't have to get anybody's approval to put out a newsletter. Just get a couple people together and start cranking that thing out.
Yes. I think that's it, and also leveraging this amazing opportunity that we've got. This connect. I mean, you and I we wouldn't be doing this without the pandemic. Yeah. It wouldn't be. We wouldn't be. People wouldn't be seeing it. And I mean, I know there's other. Oh, we should plug. Camilla will kill me if I don't. She asked me to plug the anylongtimers.org website.
Absolutely,
please check it out. It's an amazing project. Sorry, Camilla, I should have done that right at the beginning.
When I first moved down here to Fredericksburg in 2019, I had an hour and a half commute each way to work, and my friend Jojo B he told me, JoJo, everybody knows JoJo, right?
Of course, he's everywhere.
JoJo was chairing the first meeting I walked into down here, and I was like, I immediately felt welcome because that guy he just exudes the love for NA. It's unbelievable. But JoJo told me about loving our long timers. He also told me about the podcast, my recovery cast.
Yes.
And I started listening. I listened to every episode of that going back and forth to work. And I listened to, I swear I listened to about 250 of the speakers on Loving Our Long Timer that they have recorded on there. Yes. And I started categorizing them. I would send Camilla a synopsis of what they talked about, because we were going to put together a grid. And then the pandemic happened and my commute went away. So I didn't continue that project. There's so many things we can do, We have so many tools available to us. There's people who use Marco Polo to share every day. Have you ever heard of Marco Polo?
Marco Polo, I've heard of right at the beginning of the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. There's groups on a thing called Marco Polo where you just go on and you kind of share what's going on, and then like a whole bunch of other people listen to your share, and then they get on and they share. But it's all kind of individual. But it's different. But
it's really cool. I mean, for the other thing that was coming up was the global nature of things. I mean, for instance, we're big on PI here, as I told you, and we do all these things behind me, the telephone boxes and the billboards and things.
Oh, like that. I love it. That's how we do it.
Which is amazing. But we found ourselves raising money through T-shirt sales from our group, The War Is Over, and we found ourselves with excess cash, and we were going to like Johannesburg and Nigeria. The projects didn't happen, unfortunately, but we were offering money to get the similar kind of, because it was like, we're no longer confined to let's just do PI projects in Aberdeen, Scotland. Let's see where this message is most needed.
Yes.
Another beautiful thing to come out of this process.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that we can do.
There's a lot we can do. So I feel that we're kind of, we've talked so much, we're going to have to come to a part 3 on the history.
I'm fine.
But this is great. I love that we've gone off in this direction. So you're also a keen student of the history, as well as being someone who witnessed the book firsthand coming.
Oh, absolutely. And when you really look at the history, it can be humbling, because if you think your part was important, you look at the overall scheme of things and you realize, well, I just played a small part. I played a small part in a much bigger effort.
So what was it? So you've played a significant part. What can you think of that moment where you felt this humbling experience when you were delving further back before you got clean, and some of the things that you just similar to the experience that I'm having now with you?
Well, when I think about what some of the people did to make this possible, to make this all possible, there's we can go the roots of NA. You could say maybe trace all the way back to 1935, but even before the first AA meeting, when they started up the Narcotics farm in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah.
The Narcotics farm, that was the only solution, and it was one that really didn't work, but it was what their first attempt to do something with addicts besides just put them in prison, because they were putting them in prison and they were messing prisons up. That they were having a problem with the addicts, because addiction was really starting to take off in the 30s. So they started this. This is actually part of the prison system, but it was the only known facility that was trying to treat addiction, and so it was also open to anybody who voluntarily wanted to go there to try to recover, right? And back then they used to call it, they'd go to the farm for the cure, and the cure was, they'd get them cleaned up, they'd get them abstinent, but then they didn't really have an ongoing way to do it. But in 1939, when the AA Big Book came out, a copy of it found its way to the farm, to that. And there was a doctor from North Carolina who I think it was Dr. Tom M, he had become heavily addicted to morphine in his just in his practice. He had just, I guess he was taking it for some pain or whatever, but he became an addict. And he had previously been he had also had an issue with alcohol. Anyway, his narcotics addiction led him to checking himself into the farm at Lexington. And while he was there, he came across the big book of AA. And he took that, I think they might have even started having an AA meeting there. And he went through that process, went through the steps, and he got clean and he recovered. He went back to his hometown in North Carolina and started AA up there. But he always remembered, he got to know, he saw all the hopeless addicts that were there. And, they really weren't, not too many of them were fine, and they might get clean there, but they'd get out and they'd relapse. So he kept thinking, he kept saying, you guys ought to start something, like that 12-step thing for addicts. But he wasn't really in a position to do anything about it, but he would write and stuff like that. So then along came this guy his name was Houston S. And Houston S. was a guy who had found recovery in AA. And he moved to about 20 miles from Lexington, from the farm. And he got to know what was going on the farm. And he said, hey, and he really pushed to get the first Addicts Anonymous meeting got started there, where they were using the AA literature for addicts. And then they started actually kind of developing their own literature there. And
what year are we talking about then, Pete? Is this the late 30s?
No, we're up to this was like in the mid to late 40s.
Mid to late 40s.
No, it was it was about mid to late 40s that they started up the Addicts Anonymous. There was a guy named Danny C.
I know. Yeah, I've heard of him. Yeah.
And he actually, his first time was at the, and that's why I say the roots of NA really go back to 1935. He was in the first year that they opened the farm. He was there. He went through the program. He went through the program 8 times. Yeah. And all 8 times he would get clean, but then he'd come back home to New York and he'd relapse. And on the last time he went there, and I think it was his 9th time, they had just started up the Addicts Anonymous meeting. Yeah. And he embraced that, and he got it, and he took it back to New York with them, and he said, I'm going to need this so he went back and he was going to start the Addicts Anonymous in New York. And I don't know if it was somebody from the AA General Service Office or what, but somebody suggested that they come up with a different name because people could get confused between Addicts Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, would both have the AA thing.
Yeah, okay.
So and back then most addicts had issues with narcotics, so he called it Narcotics Anonymous. And that is where our name was born. Now we don't derive, on a straight line from the groups he started, but the groups he started continued into the 60s.
What was there a dialogue, a correspondence between Jimmy and Danny? I thought I might have heard that.
I think at some point there was. I think initially Jimmy found out about Danny and his correspondence with the General Service Office.
Okay.
Because he was corresponding with Bill W. from the,
yes.
One of the founders of and I think he was in touch with Danny C. And Danny, they had come up with some, they had kind of adapted the AA 12 steps to, to their Narcotics Anonymous, and they substituted initially. I think they substituted the words alcohol for narcotics, and then I think they changed it to drugs, and I think and for that and a number of other reasons, I think that Jimmy and some of the others that were starting NA in 1953 were they had somewhere along the line they got the insight that it's not the substance, it's the condition, and they said we're not powerless over a whole myriad of drugs, we're powerless over drug addiction.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, Pete, if you had any more insight into this, because as you were leading up to this point, I was going to ask you, that seems to me the fundamental, like the universal truth of our program. This was the game changer when we realized it wasn't a substance specific issue, and it's, the drugs can be long gone, but the manifestation can continue. And that seems to be, where did that incredible insight, which was the foundation for everything, where did that come from?
Those guys who started that NA in '53, there's a group of them, along with Jimmy. I think Jimmy to the day he died refused to accept that he founded NA, because he said, I didn't, we did. He always believed that we do these things together. I don't do it alone, and he believed that. And and I think one of the reasons Jimmy gets as much credit as he does is when NA almost fell apart in 1959, 1960, Jimmy was part of the core group of people that first off, he said, we have to follow traditions, and he got everyone kind of agreed. Up until then, I think there would be a debate about following traditions, because there was a dynamic figure in the 50s that sort of like was trying to lead the way, and that led to being down to one meeting that didn't even meet for 4 months in 1959.
Yeah.
Like the famous story, Bob B's story. I found the only Narcotics Anonymous meeting in the world. I think it was that one surviving NA meeting, right?
Yeah.
But once they started really following the traditions, it continued. It never got that close to dying out again. That's exactly what they needed. And then they, what they discovered over time was the other thing we needed was to have our own literature. We had to acknowledge our own culture. Yes. There's a culture of addicts. It's unique to addicts, kind of, and that's where that the other brilliant thing, in addition to coming up with the idea that it's addiction, not a substance, which is just, that's just so much a game changer. It's unbelievable. The other key thing that Jimmy wrote it. I think we can credit him. It was coming up with the idea of the therapeutic value of one addict helping another is without parallel, and that was my experience. I was going to AA for 2.5 years, and I never felt that connection. I felt like it was helping me not to drink, but I never felt that connection. I'd never made friends. I went to meetings. I thought that's what you did. I just went to meetings and didn't drink. I was getting high. I didn't even know that was a problem because they didn't talk about that there. But the first time I felt a connection was this young guy spoke at this clubhouse, and he was clever because he didn't use terms that would set off the people that didn't want to hear about drugs. He didn't go into his drug log or anything like that, but just the way he talked, I recognized he's one of my. I'm like him. I never had that recognition with anyone before that. I recognized something, and I went up to him, and I never did this, but I went up to this guy after he spoke, and I said, "Hey, your story really hit home for me." I said, you talked about some things in there, and I just really felt like I was right there with you, and he we're talking, and he just kind of laughs, and he says, "You must be an addict," and I was a little offended by it. I was like, because I had just come to terms with being what I thought was I was an alcoholic. I had said it for 2 years, but I had just read the big book for the first time, and I started to understand a little bit about recovery that it talked about in there, about the spiritual thing. I didn't know nothing about spiritual stuff, before that, in terms of recovery, and because they just weren't talking about it in those meetings at that time.
And the one of the game changers for me again was when somebody said, this NA as such, Paul, and I was like, yeah. And he's like, have you ever stopped to think what we're talking about there, NA as such? And I was like, because some of the wording was confusing to me. And he said, NA as such is the therapeutic value on that. That's a whole thing there. And it was like, there was several pennies seemed to drop.
Yeah, I think, and I also think the NA is such. So So where I might have a specific opinion about an outside issue, because we all do,
Mhm.
NA as such does not.
Mhm.
NA as such stays away from that shit, you
Mhm.
know. And if I'm in a position where if I'm speaking, like if I'm speaking in a meeting, I might be representing NA to that newcomer who's never been here before.
Yeah.
And I'm in there and I've got somebody that's got a little bit of time and I have a recovery story. If I start going off on my opinions about outside issues, I am giving that newcomer the wrong idea about NA. So
Mhm.
we have to recognize that when we are in a position where someone might be seeing us as a, you know, we have to just think about that. Like I mean, I have my concept of a higher power, but I don't go into the specifics of that
Sure.
unless someone asks, or if I'm working one-on-one with somebody. Now we're going to get down into the, you know, I'm going to tell you exactly what my belief is and what it looks like, what my higher power looks like, but I'm not going to go into that detail because I in a meeting, because the most important person in any meeting is the newcomer. And the newcomer walks in, they're not steeped on the literature. They don't even know the steps. Some do, because some are coming back from relapse or whatever. But the idea is, um, I don't want to say anything that will give them a sense of exclusion. We want them to feel welcome. So we don't harp on a specific idea of God. We
Yeah.
talk about higher power. We talk about a power greater than ourselves. I even try and stay away from the God word because I know I had connotations about that word when I was first, you know, because I was raised in a pretty, a pretty structured religion that the ideas of, some of the things that the priests did and said to me
Yeah.
didn't represent any God that I wanted to be a part of.
What were there conversations, just to go, we're going off on another, but were there any, do you remember any conversations around the use of the God word and how it might put some people off at the time of the putting the book together?
Oh, we had extensive conversations about that. There were there was a thought to include an appendix in the basic text, like the AA Big Book has an appendix on spirituality.
Yeah.
There was I think Gina H had made that suggestion. Maybe I think that was at Memphis, but there was a lot of talk about that because those that have experienced recovery know that you need to have some kind of a power greater than yourself to do this. I know many people in recovery who are atheists, and they have been able to recover, and they have been able to go through 12 steps because it doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be, it just has to be a power greater than yourself. So, and I think today there's probably more atheists than ever,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we need to make sure that the door is open for everyone, and and that you too can recover. You don't have to accept the idea of God.
I always feel that the atheist point there is kind of null and void because we are not a so theist, anti-theist is a kind of anti-religion. So we're a non-religious movement anyway. I think because even if you're an atheist, you're rejecting the idea of a religious God, but you can still grasp the concept of a higher power. So when people say even atheists can get clean, I'm thinking, hang on a minute, but that atheist religion, we're non-religious, so it's kind of like,
well, we can say, you can say one thing, but when people feel something much different than what you're saying.
yeah,
If you say we're non-religious, but you keep bringing up the G word,
it can
they're
be,
like, oh, they're trying to. I had this one guy I sponsored. He talked about, he went to his first meeting and everyone was sharing about, they were just sharing about the being an addict, right? And he felt right at home. He was like, oh wow, And then the next meeting he went to, everybody was talking about God, and he was like, oh my God, they pulled a bait and switch on me,
they can do that.
I can remember. I think what the first time I talked to this guy was after his experience that second meeting, and I just kind of told him, we don't have to believe in God here.
So,
We
so
just
we're
have to
just
something greater than ourselves.
so the conversations you were having at the time, there must have been an argument that won out, saying, "Look, we're just." I mean, there's a line I think is in the Just for Today which says, "God is a word we use for convenience. We're only interested in the power
Yeah,
behind it."
yeah.
But maybe that, but there must have been a decision at some point. Look, we're just going to use the God word, and most of us are.
Oh, sure. There was a lot of conversation about the gender.
Oh
Like,
yeah, of course.
there was a great deal of conversation about that and debate during literature conferences, and I think it just kind of came down. There was a number of us, I was myself included, that thought we should stay away from saying he, she, or just don't use a gender. Don't genderize God. Let's
Yeah,
stay away from doing that.
yeah,
And that just most literature at that time, I guess, used that terminology, and I guess group conscience was to use it. So hey, group
yeah,
conscience prevailed. So.
yeah, yeah. I wonder, I know we kind of started a little bit late, but I wonder if this is a good time. Are you up? We can just keep going with this, Peter.
I'm good. I'm not in a hurry to do it.
This is absolutely brilliant. Why don't we put a pin in it now?
Okay.
And then if you're free, we can pick it up next week.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Because I think we've just got there's so much there to talk about. So thank you in the meantime.